Okay guys, I want to do a quick video on why the bloody code ended. And I'm going to do this as if I'm answering an explain question. So what I've actually done is I've got 4 points as to why the bloody code ended, and you can try and remember 3 to use in an exam in case you get a question like this. To start with, I'm just going to do a quick overview of the bloody code. You should be quite familiar with this topic and you should be okay with it. The dates that we generally use are 1688 for the start of the bloody code. And then I always say 1868 as the end of it, although you could probably argue that in 1820 and 1830, as the governments start to reduce the amount of crimes that are punishable by death, you've really got the end of the bloody code. And the bloody code isn't like an act; it's not like a law that the government passed. It's just a period of history where we have, we have to use a name to describe why the government got really, really strict, and it all comes down to deterrent and fear of crime. Just so you're nice and clear about this, from 1688 onwards, you've got a massive increase in the amount of crimes that are capital crimes, which means they're punishable by death. So in 1688, there's 50 things that you could do as a criminal that would lead to you being executed. And as you can see, in 1765 and 1815, there's a huge jump, all right? And by 1815, there's 225 crimes that carry the death penalty. And then from the 1820s, we have a massive drop until finally in 1868, you've only got the death penalty for things like murder, murder of a police officer, and that kind of thing, which coincides with the end of public executions and the end of transportation. So why did the bloody code end? So the first reason is our friend Robert Peel, who was an MP and a reformer, and he passed 2 key pieces of legislation as Home Secretary: the 1823 Jails Act, and you can spell jails like the old-fashioned way or the new way, or you can even call it the Prisons Act, it doesn't matter. That was the reforming of prisons, which I'll do a separate video on. And then the 1829 Metropolitan Police Act, which sets up the police force, which I've got a separate video on. So that's your first reason. The first reason why the bloody code ended is because Robert Peel reformed the systems that were being used to capture and punish criminals. The second reason is juries and their reluctance to convict people and sentence them to death for crimes that they didn't actually think warranted the death penalty. In 1700, only 40% of capital crimes actually led to someone being executed. The majority of those people who weren't executed were probably transported. But this is quite important because it shows us that, 4 in 10 people are being executed. So 60% of people are not. And there's a massive reluctance in the jury to execute people for crimes that they didn't think should actually carry the death penalty. So that could be, for example, poaching. You've got someone in front of you who's been poaching rabbits to feed his family, and you're being advised to give the death penalty. I personally wouldn't feel comfortable with that. But it's other crimes as well, like, for example, low-level theft. It could be forgery. It could be, stealing things. A lot of the crimes that were under the bloody code by 1815 are not crimes that you would generally think should carry the death penalty. Now, this had a weird sort of side effect. Criminals knew this, and they were actually more confident of getting away with committing crimes and not getting a death penalty because they knew that juries would be reluctant to convict them. And this is the ironic thing about the bloody code: it actually led to an increase in crime because criminals were willing to try their luck. They knew juries wouldn't convict them for robbery or for theft, so they would, they'd have a go at it and hopefully get away with it. But that's your second reason why the bloody code ended. It just didn't really work. Juries didn't want to convict. While we could transport people, that was great as an alternative to executing them. But with the end of transportation, you've got a real problem now because you're not willing to kill these people. So what are you going to do with them? And that ties in nicely to the Prison or the Jails Reform Act of Robert Peel. Number 3, public executions weren't working. Now, public executions were designed as a deterrent. They were designed to scare people, okay? But they became like a day out. It became like an FA Cup final or semi-final. Newspapers would publicise it. They would have, details of the executions, who was being executed and what time. And so huge crowds would come out to watch them. And it got to the point where even factories just shut for the day because there was no point. People were not going to turn up for work. They were going to go and get drunk and watch an execution. And this was designed to, scare people, to make them think, "Oof, I don't want to be up on on the execution platform being killed. But actually, it worried the government, because what you had was massive gatherings of really poor people who were drunk. And the government, remember, think back to your video on the police and things like Peterloo, they were really distrustful of groups of people, especially after the French Revolution in the 1780s. So the government were worried about keeping order. And they didn't want these large groups of people gathering, especially if they didn't agree with the actual execution of the person. So that was a worry for the authorities and the public executions. And finally, ideas about punishments were changing. And this ties in obviously to Robert Peel and his reform, and people like Elizabeth Fry and John Howard, who also were important for reforming prisons. But people felt that punishments were too harsh, and that executing people under the bloody code for some of these crimes was really unfair. Obviously, from the 1780s, transportation became probably the main alternative to execution, and probably the main form of punishment. I don't know exact figures, but I would hazard a guess that more people were probably transported than they were executed in this period. But more and more people felt prisons could be the answer to reform prisoners and criminals. And from the 1830s and 40s, especially from the 1840s, as the government started to build new prisons, things like the death penalty start to really drop off quite quickly. Nice little date for you to remember is 1868. As I said, it's not officially the end of the bloody code, because you do have a huge decrease in prison in executions in the 1820s and 30s. But I like to remember 1868 because it's the end of public executions. It's essentially the end of transportation. And if you want to use it as a rough rule of thumb, you can say it's the end of the bloody code. So hopefully that's covered the reasons why the bloody code ended, and cleared things up for you there.